let me just jump in here, and obviously there's no prepared remarks. I'm hoping this is really a dialogue between all of you and what's on your mind, and I'll share certainly as frankly as possible what's on my mind. Generally speaking, when you talk about New Orleans, it's we're running up to 8 years after Katrina. The questions about the Ninth Ward, which has become the iconic symbol of the destruction by the government-run disaster, as I heard a historian refer to it the other day, levees breaking, what happened when that occurred. You know, 75–80% of the city was underwater. We still have 100,000 people who have not been able to return, so the population is still down by 25 to 30%. A city that was 67–68% African American is now edged back up to 60% African American. The period of rebuilding, if you want to call it that, is a long one. The experiments that we could go into at different levels about housing or education, where now our public school system, so-called, is the largest charter school experiment in the country. More than 80% of the students are in charter schools that are run by private companies with absolutely no oversight by an elected school board whatsoever. And so there's a lot of different things that people have tried to do in New Orleans. The Ninth Ward particularly, in the lower Ninth Ward more specifically, are still very slow in the rebuilding process after almost 8 years. There's perhaps 15% of the population is back in the lower Ninth Ward. Part of what this book actually covers is the fight to keep the Ninth Ward on the list of even being rebuilt. Many proposals right after the hurricane thought that perhaps it would be a good idea to let these areas go back to swamp and cedar, cypress trees and swamp and lowlands and park areas of some sort. But the book talks about the long fight to make sure that all areas had at least an arguable, if not an equitable, chance to rebuild, which is usually not, in fact, the case. I mean, I don't know enough about the Springfield rebuilding experience yet, and I'm hoping to learn more, but in too many areas, and there's a whole section here called Lessons from Disaster, pretty much if they say, we're going to build this back better than it was before, that's pretty much a neon sign saying there's going to be an attempt to remove elements and parts of the community so that they're not allowed to return. And in the United States, compared to Japan and elsewhere, like the Kobe earthquake disaster, where the first expenditures were to rebuild housing for low-income and senior citizens, that tends to be the last thing. We're still only 50% along the rebuilding process for a reduced footprint for public housing in New Orleans. New Orleans, as many of you may know, and my friend here with the operating engineers definitely knows, has always been nip and tuck with Miami as the lowest per capita population city in the country for a major city. So it's not we're a broke-ass town. We're not a rich town. This is not a 1% place. This is where people need resources in order to have a chance of rebuilding. And that's, I think, from a brief reading of at least the first sections of the plan, is a huge similarity between the Springfield situation and New Orleans, is that for all the talk, there's not much money. And if you look at the even outline for the plan, from philanthropy to, I mean, there are 4 or 5 sections that talk about money. And that's, part of the irony in the postscript of this book is the victory when we thought we had it was winning a huge investment for rebuilding the lower Ninth Ward, the largest of the less than a dozen areas that were picked for recovery. Rather than it being bulldozed, we won the largest single commitment to rebuild. But that's a commitment. That's not real dollars that are really spent. And that's really inordinately been the problem, is matching the best plans, arguably, with real resources to implement these plans. And in most cases, a huge part of the planning wars is trying to allow people to be able to rebuild effectively and not have the process sort of hijacked to revitalize old, often rejected proposals by business and elites for how they thought the city should have run, and saw it as a crisis they should take, should see as an opportunity, which most people credit to Rahm Emanuel. For some reason, in the Springfield plan, they credit to Norman Francis, the president of Xavier University, which is another interesting. I actually learned a lot about New Orleans reading the plan this morning. Things that they hold up as best practices, a neighborhood network that I'd never heard of that has 5 people on staff. So a lot of these things are, clearly the planners that were involved in the Springfield plan ate well for the work they did in New Orleans, because they were, prime, Clancy Goodman and a number of the others were primary beneficiaries of it. But what I would say in your plan, that's, to me almost symbolizes the very problem of all this disaster planning, whether it's New Orleans or Springfield or Joplin or Birmingham or whatever else, is the section that they have in your plan about trying to hold landlords possibly more accountable. They have a more disingenuous headline about, what do they call it, landlords, yeah, I can't remember the exact.
There's a part where they talked about mowing the lawns, where we should try to get landlords to mow the lawns.
Well, they argue for volunteers. They really don't have the resources to hold landlords accountable, so we should get volunteers to do so without explaining it. And then they tout a New Orleans design company that made a special flashcard on tenant rights. And then they sort of concede that, well, there is a problem still, because although we're touting this company that was a New Orleans company with a New York designer, they charged $10 a piece for the flashcard on tenant rights. So yeah, we'd have to do it free if we could figure out a way to get, this is literally in your plan. This is the discussion, I'm almost quoting. We'd have to figure out a way to get it for free as opposed to $10. Well, yeah, the notion that a bunch of tenants are gonna go buy a flashcard for $10 to tell them their rights, when the landlord's gonna tell them exactly where they can put that flashcard voluntarily. It's absurd. There's nothing that talks about policy changes. There's nothing that talks about any of the problems that were attendant to the immediate aftermath in Springfield, where if you compared, even the only model experience was probably Houston, where the city officials there literally jawboned the Apartment Owners Association to take tenants in from New Orleans and actually take them in before there was a commitment from FEMA to reimburse. So when we look at why we still have 50,000 New Orleans people living in Houston, that's because they could get housing, and that was the closest place they could get housing. So repatriating from Houston to New Orleans is difficult, but that was an initiative that said we need, landlords to make housing available, as opposed to most cases where you have landlords being, protected by property rights in such a way that the needs of people, particularly in a disaster, to have safe, adequate, affordable housing as close as possible to where they used to live, as opposed to, the diaspora in Katrina, as all of you know, was across all 50 states and several countries, where literally people were put on buses and ended up in, Ogden, Utah from New Orleans, never having been out of the city limits before, and that was a strange experience for many people. And